Snow White is often remembered as a story about innocence rewarded and evil punished. But before it becomes a moral tale, it functions as something colder. It observes what happens when innocence becomes visible inside a system that measures worth by comparison. Snow White does not seek power. She does not challenge authority. She does not attempt to rise. And yet, her presence destabilizes the world she inhabits. Nothing about her behavior creates conflict. Her existence does. The danger does not come from what Snow White does, but from how she is seen. She becomes a reference point, a mirror, a standard against which others are measured. This is enough to trigger reaction. The story introduces this tension early. Snow White is defined less by action than by appearance. Not vanity, but visibility. She is noticeable without trying to be. Her presence draws attention without intention. This is important. The story does not begin with wrongdoing. It begins with perception. Snow White lives in a world where value is ranked, not negotiated, where status depends on being unmatched. In such a system, innocence does not protect, it exposes. The threat she represents is silent. She does not know she is a threat. She does not attempt to become one. But visibility alone is sufficient to disturb fragile hierarchies. This is not yet a story about morality. It is a story about positioning. And once positioning becomes unstable, action follows. Snow White begins the story without strategy. Not because she rejects it, but because she has never needed it. Her world appears stable. Authority feels fixed. Roles seem clear. There is no reason to manage perception when perception does not yet feel dangerous. She does not hide. She does not perform. She does not calculate. Her behavior is consistent because the environment has not taught her otherwise. Visibility feels neutral. Being seen does not yet carry consequence. Attention is not interpreted as threat. This creates her original condition. Snow White moves through the world openly. She does not monitor how she appears. She does not adjust her presence based on who is watching. Her posture, speech, and behavior remain the same across situations. There is no internal split between who she is and how she presents herself. This is not naivety. It is alignment. Her inner state and outer expression match. There is no friction between intention and appearance. She is not attempting to signal virtue or innocence. She simply exists within it. Importantly, this condition depends on the assumption that the world does not punish passive visibility, that being seen does not invite evaluation, that value is not comparative. Snow White does not imagine herself as a rival. She does not imagine herself as exceptional. She does not measure herself against others. There is no internal ranking. But the world she inhabits does rank. This mismatch is crucial. Snow White's original condition is not dangerous in itself. It becomes dangerous only when placed inside a system that depends on hierarchy, comparison, and exclusivity. Her presence introduces contrast without intention. She becomes a reference point without consent. What was once neutral visibility begins to function as silent competition. Snow White does nothing to create this shift. She does not change. The environment does. And because she does not yet recognize that visibility has acquired weight, she does not adjust. She continues to exist as she always has, unaware that the conditions around her have begun to reinterpret her presence. This is the moment before strategy appears, the moment before awareness. The story lingers here because what follows is not caused by action, but by perception. From a Machiavellian perspective, power does not react to innocence. It reacts to displacement. The queen does not move against Snow White because Snow White acts. She moves because Snow White alters the symbolic balance of the system. Visibility, once comparative, becomes threatening. Power, in this sense, is not concerned with intent. It is concerned with position. Snow White's presence introduces a rival without declaration. She does not compete, but she is compared. She does not seek recognition, but she receives it. The Queen's authority depends on being unmatched, not morally, but perceptually. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes clear. Stability in power is not maintained through virtue alone. It is maintained through the management of appearances. When appearances shift beyond control, power feels endangered. The Queen's mirror does not describe reality, it enforces hierarchy. Snow White's visibility disrupts that hierarchy without effort. She becomes a living contradiction to the Queen's self-image. This is intolerable, not because Snow White is hostile, but because she cannot be controlled. Importantly, Snow White does not know this is happening. The threat exists only on one side. Power reacts unilaterally. This asymmetry matters. Snow White continues to behave as if visibility is neutral. The Queen begins to behave as if visibility is lethal. The system fractures along this difference in interpretation. From a Machiavellian lens, the Queen's response is not irrational, it is preventative. When power feels its position weakening, it acts early, not to punish wrongdoing, but to remove uncertainty. Snow White represents uncertainty. She is not dangerous because of what she might do. She is dangerous because of what she reflects. This is the first transformation of innocence into liability. From a Machiavellian perspective, once a perceived threat cannot be managed symbolically, it must be removed physically. Power does not require moral justification when its position feels unstable. It requires resolution. The Queen's decision to eliminate Snow White is not framed as cruelty within her own logic. It is framed as necessity. The system does not tolerate ambiguity at the top. Rival symbols cannot be allowed to persist even when they do not act. This is important. Snow White is targeted not because she is dangerous, but because she cannot be neutralized through explanation, submission, or obedience. She does nothing wrong, yet remains visible. Power does not punish her, it deletes her. This is how power protects itself when image is threatened. It does not argue, it does not persuade, it removes. What makes this elimination particularly cold is the absence of guilt. The Queen does not experience herself as unjust. She experiences herself as restoring order. The act feels administrative rather than emotional. Snow White's innocence offers no leverage here. It does not soften the decision. It does not delay it. In fact, it accelerates it. Because innocence cannot negotiate, it cannot compromise. From this angle, Machiavelli reveals something unsettling. Power is not primarily reactive to harm. It is reactive to instability. And instability can be created by presence alone. Snow White's mistake is not trust. It is remaining visible after becoming a symbol. But the story does not grant her the awareness required to hide. She is not playing the same game. She does not understand that the rules have changed. This is where innocence becomes most vulnerable. Not because it is wrong, but because it assumes a shared framework that no longer exists. The attempt to eliminate Snow White is not personal, it is structural. It reflects a system that cannot tolerate rivals it did not choose. And once power commits to removal, retreat is no longer an option. Psychologically, Jung's idea of the shadow helps explain what the story does not say directly. Snow White is not the Queen's enemy, she is the Queen's unresolved reflection. The qualities Snow White represents are not dangerous on their own: youth, beauty, vitality, ease. But these qualities become threatening when they appear outside the self, unowned and unintegrated. The Queen does not confront her own aging, insecurity, or fear of decline internally. Instead, those tensions are projected outward. Snow White becomes the container for everything the Queen cannot accept within herself. This projection changes how Snow White is perceived. She is no longer a person, she becomes a symbol, a reminder, a living comparison. In Jungian terms, the shadow is not evil by nature, It is simply what has been pushed out of awareness. When it appears externally, it is often experienced as hostile, even when it is passive. Snow White does nothing to provoke this reaction. She does not reflect intentionally. She simply exists. But existence is enough when projection is active. The Queen's aggression is not driven by hatred of Snow White as an individual. It is driven by refusal to confront internal conflict. Destroying Snow White feels easier than integrating what she represents. This is why the reaction is so extreme. Projection amplifies threat. What might have been discomfort becomes danger. What could have been self-reflection becomes elimination. Snow White carries the shadow without consent. From Snow White's perspective, none of this is visible. She does not experience herself as symbolic. She does not understand that her presence carries psychological weight for others. She continues to move through the world as if relationships are direct, not projected. This creates a quiet asymmetry. Snow White is responding to people. Others are responding to images they carry inside themselves. Living as a reflection is dangerous because it removes agency. Snow White cannot change what she represents without changing who she is, and she is not aware that such a change is being demanded. The story does not give her tools for integration or concealment. She is not taught to manage perception. She is not taught to recognize projection. She remains transparent in a world that has become interpretive. This transparency no longer protects her, it exposes her. From a psychological angle, this is where innocence becomes fragile. Not because it is false, but because it is unguarded. Snow White's inner and outer selves remain aligned, while others split theirs. She does not fragment, the world around her does. The cost of this alignment is vulnerability. Snow White absorbs the consequences of conflicts that are not hers. She is acted upon by forces she does not understand, responding to tensions she did not create. The story does not frame this as her failure. It presents it as a condition. When the shadow is projected outward, the innocent often become targets simply by being visible. This is not a lesson in psychology. It is an observation about how unexamined inner conflict behaves when it finds a surface. From Nietzsche's perspective, the question is not whether Snow White's values are good, but whether they can survive inside the world she inhabits. Snow White embodies values that do not compete: kindness, trust, openness, passivity. These values do not seek dominance, they do not impose themselves, they assume a shared moral space. Nietzsche's insight is uncomfortable here. Values are not tested by intention, but by pressure. When power is threatened, values that refuse force offer no resistance. Snow White does not lose because she is weak. She loses because her values do not protect her from predation. They do not disguise her. They do not allow retreat. They make her visible and undefended. This does not invalidate those values. It reveals their limits. In a world structured by hierarchy, innocence becomes an invitation, not to care, but to act. Power does not interpret purity as virtue. It interprets it as availability. Snow White's values were never chosen. They were inherited. They worked only while the environment remained stable. Once power felt threatened, those values were no longer neutral. They became liabilities. Nietzsche would not condemn Snow White for this. He would observe it. Values that depend on protection collapse when protection is removed. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural one. The story does not suggest that Snow White should abandon her values. It shows that values without force are vulnerable to systems that reward domination. What breaks is not goodness. What breaks is the assumption that goodness is safe. After values are exposed, but before withdrawal becomes possible, Snow White enters a suspended state. Nothing is resolved yet, but something has changed. She senses danger without understanding its source. The world around her feels the same. People speak normally, daily routines continue, but attention carries a different weight. Looks linger, silence feels longer. Safety no longer feels assumed. This is not fear in the dramatic sense, it is unease. Snow White does not know she is being measured. She does not know she has become a symbol. She only feels that her presence no longer passes unnoticed. What was once neutral has become charged. She has not been told to hide. She has not been warned. This is the cost of remaining visible inside a system that is already decided. Snow White continues to behave as she always has. Her openness does not change because she does not know it should. She does not adopt caution because caution has never been required before. Her alignment remains intact, even as the environment begins to read her differently. This creates a quiet tension. She feels watched but not accused, observed but not addressed. There is no confrontation, no explanation, no clear signal of threat. That is what makes the moment destabilizing. The danger does not announce itself, it accumulates silently. Snow White begins to feel out of place without knowing why. Her innocence offers no interpretive tools for this shift. She does not understand suspicion. She does not recognize comparison. She cannot identify projection, so she internalizes confusion instead. What has changed is not her behavior, it is the meaning assigned to it. This is where innocence becomes most fragile, not because it is false, but because it cannot explain what is happening. Snow White cannot defend herself against something that has not been spoken. She cannot adapt to rules that have not been named. Remaining visible now carries psychological weight. Each moment of exposure feels heavier than the last, not painful, but pressing, as if something is approaching without direction. The story does not dramatize this phase. It allows it to linger quietly. Snow White exists in a narrowing space, still present, still seen, but no longer safe. This is not yet exile, it is anticipation. The cost here is not physical, it is internal disorientation. Snow White begins to sense that something about her presence is unacceptable, even though nothing about her actions has changed. She does not blame herself, she does not blame others. She simply remains, unaware that remaining is becoming impossible. This is the final moment before adaptation, before disappearance, before the story resolves itself by removing her from view. The cost of remaining visible is not punishment, it is erosion. And once erosion begins, it does not reverse on its own. After Snow White is removed from the center of power, the story changes shape. It becomes quieter, more isolated, less visible. Withdrawal replaces presence. Snow White survives only by disappearing, not through strategy, but through removal. She is no longer compared, no longer ranked, no longer mirrored. The danger fades not because power softens, but because attention shifts. This is important. The threat was never personal, it was positional. Once Snow White exits the hierarchy, she exits danger. The world does not become kinder, it becomes indifferent. The forest is not safe, it is simply outside the system. Snow White's withdrawal does not feel like victory, it feels like exile. Survival requires invisibility. What once defined her becomes something she must hide. The story records this without judgment. It does not present withdrawal as wisdom or failure. It presents it as adaptation. When innocence is punished by visibility, disappearance becomes protection. The cost is quiet. Snow White remains herself, but at the edge of the world, alive but unseen. By the end of the story, innocence has not been redeemed, power has not been corrected, no moral balance is restored. What has changed is understanding. Snow White does not learn strategy, she does not integrate aggression, she does not become harder. She survives by stepping outside the system that punished her presence. The story does not argue that innocence should be abandoned. It shows that innocence becomes dangerous when it is visible to power that measures itself through comparison. Snow White's tragedy is not trust, it is exposure. Her values are not wrong, they are unprotected. The tale ends without offering instruction, It does not tell us to hide, to fight, or to dominate. It only shows how systems respond to what they cannot control. When innocence becomes visible inside a hierarchy, it is not rewarded, it is removed. What remains is not a lesson, but a pattern, one that repeats wherever power feels threatened by what it cannot integrate. The forest still exists, the mirror still speaks. Invisibility, once noticed, is never neutral again, until the next observation.